Today's lesson is going to be on Chapter 9, Lesson 4, Independent and Dependent Events. We're going to be continuing our chapter on probability, going over some vocabulary, key ideas, and as well as some examples of things that you'll do with your homework and on the test as well. So make sure that you're doing your notes and following along. If you have questions, you can ask them in class tomorrow when I see you. Otherwise, we'll just go ahead and get started. So independent events, when the occurrence of one event does not affect the likelihood that the other event will occur. Dependent events, when the occurrence of one event does affect the likelihood that the other event will occur. So independent does not affect the likelihood of the other event. Dependent events, the occurrence of one event does affect the likelihood that the other will occur. So I will show you an example of this so that you can kind of see what that looks like when we talk about independent and dependent events. So our first example is going to be looking at identifying independent and dependent events. So letter A says that you flip heads on one coin and tails on another coin. So the outcome of flipping one coin does not affect the outcome of flipping the other coin. And so those two events are independent of each other. So flipping heads on one coin and then flipping tails on another coin, they don't affect each other, and so those are independent events. B, on the other hand, your teacher chooses one student to lead a group and then chooses another student to lead another group. So when we look at this one, the teacher cannot pick the same student to lead both groups. So there are fewer students to choose from when the leader of the second group is chosen. And so those events are dependent because the choosing of the second student to be the leader is dependent on what the outcome is for the teacher choosing the first student to lead a group. So those are dependent on each other because the first event affects the outcome of the second event. All right, and that is identifying independent and dependent events. So we're going to look at a key idea for this lesson and then look at an example of it. So our key idea that we're going to look at next is the probability of independent events. And so what this is the probability of two independent events, A and B, is the probability of A times the probability of B. Okay, so you have two events, A and B. So the probability of these two independent events is A times the probability of B. So what that's going to look like is you have the probability of A and B, so this is the probability of both events, is going to equal the probability of A, the first event, times the probability of B, which is the probability of the second event. So the probability of the first event multiplied by the probability of the second event gives you the probability of both independent events. So this is for independent events. This is how you can find the probability of them. And so we're going to look at an example of this. All right, so finding the probability of independent events. So you flip two quarters. What is the probability you flip two heads? So you can figure this out one of two ways. So the first method is to use a tree diagram to find the probability. So we have our first flip where we're flipping a heads or a tails. And then with our second flip, we're either going to get a heads or tails. So we either end up with 2 heads with the first and second flip, a heads and tails, or we end up with the tails and heads or tails and tails. So the probability of flipping 2 heads would be 1 out of 4, because there are 4 outcomes that we could possibly get, and only one of those outcomes gives us 2 heads. And so it is 1 out of 4. So P, our probability of getting 2 heads, is the number of times 2 heads can occur over the total number of outcomes. So there's 4 outcomes, and the only time that we can get 2 heads is there, so there's only 1. So it would be 1 over 4 for our probability. Now the second method we can use is that formula that we were looking at in our key idea. So this one, our method 2, uses the formula for independent events. So probability of A and B equals the probability of A times the probability of B. So our probability of heads and heads equals the probability of heads the first time times the probability of heads the second time. So we have half a chance, a 1 over 2 chance of getting heads the first flip, and we have a 1 over 2 chance, or a 50% chance of getting a heads in the second flip. So 1/2 times 1/2 equals 1/4. So the probability of getting 2 heads is going to be 1 over 4. So that's 2 ways that you can find the probability of independent events. Remember, independent events are events that the first event does not affect the second event. So next we're going to look at dependent events and how to find the probability of dependent events. So another key idea that we're going to look at is the probability of dependent events. And so what this is the probability of 2 dependent events, A and B, is the probability of A times the probability of B after A occurs. So once again, we have the probability of A and B, which is the probability of both events, is going to equal the probability of A, which is the probability of the first outcome, or the first event, the probability of the first event, times the probability of B after A. And this is the probability of the second event after the first event occurs. So that is the probability of dependent events. So we're going to look at an example of what that is going to look like. So our last example that we're going to look at is finding probability of dependent events. So the events that we're going to be looking at is flowers in a vase. So you randomly choose a flower from the vase to take home. Your friend randomly chooses another flower from the vase. What is the probability that you choose a purple flower and your friend chooses a yellow flower? So in the vase we have 7 purple flowers, 9 yellow flowers, and 12 pink flowers. So first we're going to look at what the probability of getting the purple flower is going to be. So P, we're looking at our first event being, the first flower chosen being purple, and that is going to be 7 over 28. 7 being the number of purple flowers, 28 being the total number of flowers. So when we add 12 plus 9 plus 7, that gives us a total of 28. So there are 7 purple flowers, 28 flowers total. So our probability is 7 over 28. When we reduce that, that gives us a probability of 1 over 4. And so that's the probability of event A. Now we're going to look at the probability for our second event, which is choosing a yellow flower. So P, the probability of the second being yellow, is going to end up being 9 over 27. 9 being the number of yellow flowers that are in the vase. 27 being the total number of flowers that are left after you chose your purple flower the first time. So instead of there being 28 flowers, there are now 27 because there's one missing. Remember, we're talking about dependent events, so the second outcome is affected by the outcome of the first event. So 9 over 27, when we reduce that, gives us 1 over 3. So to find our probability of A and B, remember we multiply the first event times the probability of the second event after A. So we have the probability of purple and yellow, and that is going to equal the probability of a purple flower times the probability of a yellow flower after purple. So our two probabilities, we have 1/4 and we have 1/3. And so we're going to take those and multiply them together. So 1/4 times 1/3 is going to equal 1/12. So the probability of choosing a purple flower then a yellow flower is 1 over 12, or 8%. And so that is finding probability of dependent events. Because remember, that first event is going to affect the outcome of that second event. All right, it is now time for you to do your on your own questions. Have that done for class tomorrow, and we will go over those at the beginning of the class, and then it will be your time to ask questions or just go ahead and get working on your assignment. So I will see you in class tomorrow.